Hey there. As seems to be becoming more and more common, today's video was inspired by a conversation I had with a witchy skeptic friend online. And since my response had turned into a 3,000-word essay anyway, I figured I might as well share it with all of you guys too. Before beginning though, a quick housekeeping note. As this channel grows and as I interact more and more with you guys through messaging and comments, the fact that I'm not using my name, or any name in fact, has become cumbersome. Who would have guessed? Now, in order to balance anonymity with, the capacity to address me or refer to me in conversation, I've decided a handle or nom de plume is in order. So rather than forcing you all to call me that lady from Headology and the Witch, or the Headology and the Witch person whose name I don't know, I'm just going to go by the personal handle of Hetty from here on out. Hopefully it'll spare you all from carpal tunnel in the future. On with the discussion. I've frequently heard others bemoan that their skepticism holds back their study of witchcraft, despite their desire to explore this path. I absolutely and completely understand the clash. I struggled with this same issue for a very long time, and it sucked and confused the hell out of me. But I come bearing happy news. It can be overcome. The trick is in not trying to override that skepticism, but to work with and within it. Because your skepticism isn't the problem. The way it's manifesting and the way you feel compelled to respond to it is. This isn't due to any weakness or failing on your part either. It's simply the result of how witchcraft is packaged most commonly, and that you've not yet sorted out how best to engage with the challenge these things present. Both of these issues can be addressed if you choose to. I think that the single most important rule when doing so is this: be honest with yourself. If you follow this rule, you'll never have to worry about the value of your pursuits and practice. In the craft, honesty will keep you out of the tall grass. Mimicking the true believers out there is not the goal of the skeptical would-be witch, even though it sometimes feels like that's what everybody else does, and therefore might be a good approach to dealing with your skepticism and the conflict it produces. But it's not the best way. It's not a way, period, because this false solution is destined to fail. Any practice that requires you to be intellectually dishonest with yourself isn't worthy of you, and some part of you will always begrudge you for trying to delude yourself this way. That part of you will, in turn, undermine your efforts and progress, and your misgivings will follow you forever, coloring even your most genuine experiences with doubt. By the way, the compulsion to delude yourself into believing that which you don't believe is, I'm fairly confident, a manifestation of fear. Fear that nothing you've heard or read about witchcraft is true. Fear that, even if it is, you personally are incapable of pulling it off and always will be. Fear that, even if you could, it wouldn't enrich or better your life. But you needn't be afraid of these sorts of failures, because if you're honest with yourself, I think you'll probably have no trouble admitting that you don't know everything about either yourself or the world, nor have you experienced everything the world and your mind has to offer. Some part of you also no doubt realizes that in exploring new opportunities, you're not betraying your intellectual philosophy. You're living by it. You have a scientist's spirit. Good. It's the same thing as a witch's spirit in my practice. Scientists explore. We question. We discover. We extrapolate. We reach for an understanding of ourselves and the universe we live in, and turn what we find to our betterment and advantage. And then we do it again, building upon what we've learned forever, knowing that we'll never exhaust the well of wonders that we draw from, because it is itself infinite. Witches do all that too, or this one does. There is no shame in discovery or in seeking the unknown, nor is honest evaluation in any way incompatible with these acts. Witchcraft doesn't require that you come to the table with either faith or skepticism. And sure, some of your explorations will end in puzzlement, or contradictions, or lead to something too inscrutable to make use of, or just fail outright. Congratulations! You now know what the first couple years of grad school feels like. The thing is, though, that there is absolutely zero chance that all of your explorations lead nowhere. It simply isn't possible. Neither you nor I know enough about all the fields related to the craft to remain unsurprised and unchallenged by their exploration. Show me a person who makes a genuine effort in every witchy realm and still nevertheless manages not to learn anything worthwhile, and I'll show you a liar. And so my recommendation to you is this: fuck belief, and toss out any practice that you can't currently bring yourself to swallow, too. Pursue instead the inroads into the craft that do not seem to you to require eschewing the empirical evidence you value deeply, and see where those lead. They will provide you with more than enough opportunity to explore and discover and begin collecting personal experiences that support the worthiness of your attempts. And as you learn through your own experiences and in compiling the evidence provided by others, whether they're scientists, spiritualists, or both, you may come back around to reevaluating some of those aspects you initially discarded. Again, there's no reason to force that process. It'll happen naturally anyway, because none of us is right about everything, and so all of us change our minds about some things eventually. With that said, let's move on to one of the classic interpretations of spiritual practices, which seems to throw skeptics for a loop, even though it really shouldn't. Those things you're doing are probably all in your head. My friend brought this up, along with a most excellent retort, courtesy of everybody's favorite Hogwarts headmaster. Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it isn't real? For me, the sentiment behind the "it's in your head" thing highlights a couple of common misconceptions relating to, 1, the fact that the world we experience isn't a carbon copy of reality itself, but a perceptual interpretation of reality that is being filtered through our sensory organs and brain, and reacted to only as a result of that translation. And 2, the fact that many of us delude ourselves into thinking that we actually understand this process and are consciously aware of what's going on within the black box that is the human brain. The idea that something being in your head somehow means it's not real is tantamount to suggesting that your sense of personal identity isn't only irrelevant but doesn't even exist, that your consciousness could be removed without impact. What goes on in your mind determines how you experience every externally and internally elicited event that will ever occur while you're alive. If the mental perceptions generated by your brain aren't real, well then, friend, nothing else is either. But aside from that, I also enjoy the irony of the "it's all in your head" thing, because, in my personal opinion, one excellent place for the skeptic would-be witch to start when it comes to exploring the craft is for them to engage in practices that are explicitly focused on being in your head, namely, the induction of different mental states. This is, for me and many others, the absolute foundation of the craft and the seed from which the majority of my other practices derive. And as far as execution goes, it relies on nothing but science, baby. But let's say you're one of those people who just rolled their eyeballs out of their sockets at that last sentence. One who is skeptical about all the meditation, trance, astral travel stuff. What then? First off, let me simply state that I don't think it's either surprising or unreasonable to hold such views. After all, as a skeptic, and pardon me in advance for generalizing, but you probably by and large respect two sources of evidence beyond all others: personal experience and scientific data. And until very recently, one of those was no help to you at all. There's historically been scant scientific research on altered states, in part because of lack of motivation on the part of researchers and funding bodies, and in even larger part because of technical limitations. But that's been changing, and the punchline is that, as it stands now, there's no real question that altered perceptual states associated with meditation, trances, etc. actually result in both immediate and long-lasting changes in neural processing. We've got hard scientific data on this front from labs at some of the world's most respected institutions, even though it's early days yet. The notion that the altered neural patterns must themselves necessarily be associated with specific perceptual experiences is somewhat more tenuous, because it's hardly been examined. But on the whole, it looks like the science is leaning decisively in the direction of we frosted spiritualist flakes this time. So you're not betraying the science tribe by engaging in meditative practices. Quite the opposite, actually. Even though, yes, I admit descriptions of the subjective experiences associated with these altered states nevertheless instinctively strike people who've never engaged in them as mushy or fantastical bullshit. It's totally forgivable to be turned off by such talk. But I'd like to suggest that it sounds like bullshit in part because of that thing I said earlier about people feeling like they know what their own brains are capable of. Or rather, because we often doubt that our brains are able to do things we've never personally experienced. We're much more likely to believe that those claiming to experience altered mental states that sound totally foreign to us are just engaging in regular daydreaming and applying wishful thinking after the fact. It's a tidier explanation to the uninitiated, and has the added benefit of meaning that we're not really missing out on anything. But altered mental states really are a thing, and you too can experience them. You can get really good at experiencing them, and do so at will and without dosing up on pharmaceuticals. People say that the brain is a muscle, which is wrong, obviously. But it is a structure that responds to exercise, to experience, to repetition, by altering its physical conformation and therefore how it functions. You may have heard the saying, neurons that fire together wire together, which is a description of what's called Hebbian plasticity. It's one of the fundamental mechanisms of learning, and a description of how experience literally alters the facility with which different brain cells and neural ensembles communicate with one another. Every experience changes the paths of communication, strengthening some and weakening others. Your brain is therefore in constant flux, eternally biased towards thinking, feeling, and perceiving things according to the relative strengths of all those neural connections. Find the right combination of cues and reinforcement to strengthen the pathways supporting a mental state, and you can quite literally learn to induce shifts in perception, or feel an omnipresent connection with the earth. And yeah, again, I know it sounds like mystical crap, but it's not. It's just a byproduct of one of the first things kids learn in Psych 101, a byproduct of a mechanism our brains are explicitly designed to use. Billions of years of evolution have gone into building a machine that is optimized for receiving input and producing output based on the probability of that output leading to a particular outcome. Some combinations of input and output are easily acquired, that is, rapidly learned and executed. Some are even innate or inherited. Other combinations of input and output are harder to program and therefore take longer to achieve. But the rules of the brain's input to output system are, in many cases, amazingly straightforward. Stimulus, reaction, result. Basic association. If X, then Y, so that's Z. Training yourself to achieve altered states is like training a puppy. It starts as chaos, nonstop distractions, and misbehavior. But step by step, through trial and error and reward, you get closer to the desired result every time, simply by reinforcing the behavior you seek and discouraging that you don't want. Are you sitting? Have a treat. Are you sitting still and being quiet? Good girl! Now the first part of the trick, then the next, and on until the whole thing comes together. And as the learning process proceeds, the first step lays the groundwork for the second, eventually coming to trigger the second itself, transforming into a cue that thereafter actually facilitates the rest of the process. The precursors become a rolling ball that gathers mass and momentum, and drives the rest of the program to what becomes an inevitable end. Again, with enough practice. These mental skills are developed over time because in practicing we are physically changing the neural landscape within our brains and facilitating and/or inhibiting certain patterns of activity that either are or are not associated with specific mental states. We're strengthening some wiring, weakening others, and correcting neural misbehavior and mistakes as we go. So, dear skeptic, this is all to say that the question at issue isn't whether altered states are real and achievable, and therefore whether it's okay to try to achieve them. They are, and it is. The scientific evidence absolutely supports the idea that we can alter our brain function and perceptions through meditation, pathworking, trance, whatever. The extent to which we can achieve this is still an open question, but regardless of the actual physical limits, if you're new to this, please be assured that the horizons are well beyond anything you've personally achieved yet. The only real question the skeptic needs to concern themselves with, therefore, is what is the relevance of these various altered states? That is a much harder question to answer, and the science of voluntary alterations of mental states can't really answer it for us. But for the skeptical witch, I think part of the answer relates back to what I said earlier about the brain as a black box and the mistaken impression we have that we're relatively conscious of how we process information and how our thoughts, behaviors, perceptions, and emotions are affected by that processing. We have oodles of scientific evidence demonstrating that people are aware of only a tiny fraction of these processes. There's a mountain's worth of crap happening in the background of our brains, and 99.9% spend our lives standing at the base of this mountain looking the other way. I think that the most conservative, defensible interpretation of the experiences associated with altered states is that they can either give voice and image to the ghosts in the machine or silence them further. That they allow us to exert more direct control over these processes, or alternately, they can allow us to observe and engage more directly with the contents of the black box without our egos quashing the exploration by overruling the weirdness and patterns that emerge. Also, for the record, these experiences can be really fucking fun. Or more accurately, they can be really fucking fill in the blank with any emotion here, depending on what state you induce. As a group, spiritual types spend a lot of time focusing on what could be termed positive states, but that's certainly not the only option when it comes to altered states. Now, of course, for some, altered mental states are much more than simply fun times or glimpses into the inner workings of their mind. For some, they're experienced as sacred acts of connection. But for you uber skeptics out there, that's neither here nor there and has no bearing on the potential utility and benefits of such skills for you. Because whatever else they are, the chance to peer into the foreign corners of one's own mind and the ability to become adept at taking those trips at will can be reason enough for the skeptical would-be witch to sink some effort into trying them out. The only justification you really need for doing any of this is that you want to. Let your own experiences in the realms of altered states therefore dictate what other conclusions you draw from them. As ever, you needn't commit to an interpretation of an experience before having properly explored the experience itself. A final note on the desire for evidence. Just because you don't know about the latest evidence doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but gosh, wouldn't it be kind of fun if you were kept at least partly up to date? In the spirit of this, I've lately been toying with the idea of producing some Witches Journal Club videos. For those who don't know, academics frequently have something akin to book club discussions, except with peer-reviewed scholarly articles, where we debate and discuss the merits, weaknesses, and implications of others' research. Pagan book reviews are plentiful in the witchy YouTube community, which is awesome, and I frankly don't think I'd be contributing anything overly worthwhile by adding my own. But there's some really interesting stuff in the neuroscience lit about topics that I think might be of interest to the witchy community. and I suspect that I am in fact well positioned to provide discussions on that score. So let me know in the comments if you guys would actually be interested in seeing videos from me about some of the scientific research going on in the fields of altered states and spirituality. I'll consider your response, or lack thereof, when making my decision whether to put something like this together. Until next time, witches and skeptics, I hope I was able to provide a bit more detail on my thoughts regarding developing a practice when one isn't sold on the woo. But regardless, I wish you a wonderful night.